Well, we can continue our lesson on energy. And as I've already said, in the second part, we will examine what energy has represented for humans and what it represents today. And we analyze this because the starting point now is, can we think of reducing the amount of energy transformations? We have seen that by reducing energy transformations, we would reduce the speed with which the sand falls in the hourglass. But we also have to understand the implications of this kind of choice. So we're now talking about energy and civilization. I would like to begin by reading this sentence taken from the book by the title Guida all'energia nella natura e nelle civiltà umane, curated by Michele Calì, with my contribution. He says, quote, "Everything that humankind has achieved in the course of history has been possible only because the elaboration of thought has been accompanied by the growth of the control, production, transport, and use of energy flows, far superior to those strictly necessary to satisfy biological needs." End of quote. So this means that humanity's evolution was linked mainly to elements: the ability to think and elaborate thought, and energy availability. So, in this image, we can see what happened in the time between the Paleolithic era, 2.5 million years ago, and today. So in this first diagram, you see the three ages: Paleolithic, Neolithic, and Modern Age, in terms of the percentage of time that they occupied, they lasted. So you can see that 96.1% of that time is occupied by the Paleolithic period. A bit less than 4% is the Neolithic period, and only 0.1% is the period covered by the Modern Age. So the amount of time that we associate with the Modern Age is only 0.1% of this whole time. But if we look at the amount of people living in those periods, the situation changes, because if the total of humans who have ever lived is 100, then we see that the Paleolithic era, which lasted very long, had only 12% of people. In the Neolithic age, which was much shorter than the Paleolithic one, we have 68% of people. And in this 0.1% of time, we have concentrated 20% of all humans who have lived from 2.5 million years ago until today. And what about energy? So at world level, in the Paleolithic era, energy consumption was 0.05 exajoules. In the Neolithic era, that consumption gets to 1, so 20 times higher. But as I said earlier, today we get to about 550 exajoules. So there is a 20% increase between Paleolithic and Neolithic era, but between the Neolithic era and today, the value is more than 500 times higher. So you can see how all the changes in time have brought a very important increase in energy consumption. And let's now analyze all this in more detail. And we start with the Paleolithic era from 2.5 million years ago to 10,000 years ago. In this period, humans were mainly nomad. They were hunters. They were also gatherers, because they would also gather berries and fruit they might find while moving around. Then, about 800,000 years ago, humans learned to control fire. And this is one of the changing elements for human behavior. Because controlling fire, humans could protect themselves better from animals. They could use fire for light, but also to cook food. And this subject has already been touched upon in the previous lessons. Cooking food also provides different conservation and storage methods. Fire can be used for heating. Humans also started creating clay containers, and so we have the first rudimentary cultures. So with the ability to control fire, the foundation is laid for sedentary life. So humans become farmers in the Mesolithic era and the early Neolithic era, so from 10,000 years ago to 3,200 years ago. And as humans become sedentary, we have groups staying within a limited territory. And due to the concentration of people living there, from this territory, we need to take elements, food for living. So humans become farmers, and they start looking for ways to make those fields more productive. And so we have some innovation, that thought development I mentioned before. In this diagram, we find information on the animals used to draw plows to farm the land. And as you can see, horses had both the best ability to draw and the highest power. And I would like for you to focus on this column of power, because horses have a maximum power of 850 watts, and all the others have a power of a few hundred watts. So this means that besides their own muscle power, humans had only animal power at their disposal, consisting of a few hundred watts. And if you look around your house, at the household appliances you will see that a few hundred watts is a power that is found in our communication systems. So our desktop or laptop might have this level of power. But if you look at your dishwasher, your washing machine, or normal household appliances, we are always way above, so around a kilowatt of power. So the amount of energy we have available today is much higher than that available at that time. And more about innovation in agriculture. So besides plowing fields, of course, in order to improve productivity, fields had to be watered adequately. So the problem is how to get the water to the field through irrigation systems. Taking water from wherever it was available, be it wells or rivers. And here you can see some of the systems that were used in ancient times. And especially in this table, you see a summary of tons of water per tons of product. We are mainly talking about cereals. And so these are the quantities of water that had to be made available on the field to ensure a significant production. And here you see various systems, including shadoof or sakia here. And this is, of course, not a picture of the Neolithic system, but the current system is basically the same. It is still based on manually activated levers. And this dragon backbone used in China, as you see here, it was managed by men, but it could also be activated by animals. And anyway, it was a way to take water from a basin up to an irrigation system on a field. So here we're still using human power, and here we also use animal power in this solution down here. So to give you an example, with the shadoof in ancient Egypt, a single worker lifted about 3 cubic meters of water per hour from a 2.5 meters depth, because of course these solutions couldn't go to very great depths. So this is what happened when humans became more sedentary. And the situation evolved, of course, all the way to the industrial age. So this part that is called pre-industrial age is a time when, of course, ingenuity and thought processing continued and increased. And humans used levers and gears better and better, and so they made windmills that were more and more efficient. But the main point that we need to consider in this lesson is that from the point of view of the overall energy available during this period, the amount of energy was always the same. So it was the energy that was available from food, that is mechanical and kinetic energy, coming from the strength of human muscles and animal muscles, and then energy from flowing waters and from the wind. And then the third source of energy available over that period was fire. Of course, fire was always made from biomass, that is wood. And then around the 17th century, the first coal mines were found, so we have a new fuel. So this goes on, and to give you an idea of the energy consumptions, because at the beginning we saw that in the modern age energy consumption went up. But if we look at the average per capita consumption, here the measurement unit are gigajoules. In the Paleolithic era, we have 8.4 gigajoules. When humans became farmers, their per capita consumption was 12.6. Then at the time of Greeks and Romans, it was about 21. And this value stays the same all the way through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period. So the energy consumption basically stays the same until we get the steam engine and industrial revolution. You know that these two elements coincide. So the Industrial Revolution begins with the invention of the steam engine. But this was not the only technological invention. Many others innovations were introduced. For example, here you see the image of a spinning jenny, which was a very important innovation because it enabled to speed up the spinning operations. So weaving and looms had already been sped up by introducing the steam engine and therefore using mechanical energy in much higher quantities compared to the past. And this had made looms go much faster. But their weaving speed wasn't matched by the spinning speed. So the jenny, which you can see here, allowed for a general increase in both spinning and weaving speed, thus overall increasing production. So the steam engine was introduced in 1705 if we consider Newcomen's invention, or in 1796 if we consider the more famous one, that is Watt's engine. Anyway, this opens up the industrial age, which brings about important change in the organization of work and in society. Now, I would like to stop here for a second on this and the steam engine. I would like to ask, what was the driver for the invention of the steam engine? Of course, not everything is clear when history is explained, but as I said, coal mines were discovered in the 1600s, but coal was mainly used for heating or to produce high temperatures for metalworking. So at the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century, coal started being scarce. So coal was used to produce thermal energy because there was no steam engine yet. So, of course, there was no possibility to change heat into mechanical work. So there was a shortage of coal. And, coal mines were in the open, so they started digging from the surface and went deeper and deeper to find new coal. Of course, considering that there was a shortage of it. What happens is that while digging, I can find water aquifers. And so the mine gets flooded. And what do I have to do in that case? I need to take that water out of the mine. And to do that, I need a pump. I need a system to move water. And of course, with the energy that was available back then, the systems were the ones we saw earlier, so based on animals and human muscle power. So then, the need was felt for a system able to move water and take it out of the coal mines, where coal was being dug. So this again brought to thought processing, and actually the first steam engines were pumps. So you see, again, we have a great invention that really radically and deeply changed society and the organization of work. And this invention stemmed from a need and from the fact that humans started looking for a solution to a problem. And then what happened is that one machine was built, and then another one by a different producer, and then a different producer makes a different machine. And so there's competition based on how well producers could build these steam engines. Because, of course, after a while, it was seen that it wasn't just a pump, but a system to convert thermal energy into mechanical energy. So this competition entails comparisons. It means that somebody needs to be able to see or assess if a machine is better than another one. So what does this mean? It means that I will ask, with a kilo of coal, how much mechanical work does your machine produce? So, with the same quantity of energy for functioning, how good is this machine at producing work? Whoever produces more work, of course, has a better performance. And then there is another question, and this is actually for those who try to produce a better product through competition. So can I improve this machine without a limit? So with a kilo of coal, is there a maximum amount of work that I can produce? Well, once again, we find clear answers from Carnot in 1824. I'd like to read you two passages. I think reading these texts helps us to contextualize and understand how things that we take for granted actually had a significant value at the time when they were invented. Carnot writes, as with the majority of human inventions, the discovery of fire machines originates from more or less confused attempts, and for lack of information, their paternity is often unclear or attributed to the wrong person. No. Actually, we're now reading Carnot's words, but you have already found the same concepts in Pievani's lessons on the fact that human inventions, as Carnot says, stem from more or less confused attempts. He says, after all, the main discovery does not consist in these initial attempts, but in the following improvements that led fire machines to today's conditions. The distance between the first machines, where the steam power of expansion was developed, and the current ones is about the same as the distance separating the first raft ever built by humans from tall ships. And he goes on, if the honor of discovery belongs to the nation that ensured its progress and development, then this honor cannot but be attributed to Great Britain. Savary, Newcomen, Smeaton, Watt, Wolfe, Krivtik, and a few other British engineers are the real creators of fire machines, which, thanks to them, has been further improved. So, as you heard, Carnot says that machines, and please note that all these machines, like the steam engine, were invented much earlier than thermodynamics. So first we built the machine, and then we understood how it worked. And in this regard, let me get to the other point. So in this market competition, one of the questions we mentioned was, with a kilo of coal, what is the maximum power I can produce? And Carnot answers this question, because, of course, this is all found in the second law. Carnot says, as regards the former statement, well, because earlier he was saying that the system he was describing obtains the same results regardless of the fluid inside it. He writes, as regards the former statement, one might very well ask the following question: what is the meaning of the word maximum? How can we recognize that this maximum was reached and that steam was used to produce power in the most efficient way possible? And these are the very questions I was referring to earlier. Okay, let me jump ahead. He says, so the necessary condition to reach this maximum is that in the bodies used to produce the heat power, no temperature variation happen unless it is due to a volume variation. And of course, I will not go too much in detail because this is not a course in thermodynamics, but with the students of my course, I will analyze all this. But here, we have the basis to explain why the Carnot cycle, the cycle that he identified as necessary to transform heat into work, well, the Carnot cycle is the most efficient one. So let's see all these new technologies. Let's see where they are bringing us. So here you can see the various technologies that were introduced from the steam engine to the electric engine, the gasoline engine, the vacuum, commercial aviation, television, nuclear energy, so everything that has to do with electronics and calculation, and then the internet. So starting from 1850 and to 2008, in this case, of course, there is a period where the quantity of energy grows, but not significantly, and then consumption takes off. So there's a very rapid increase in the amount of energy consumed. And this happens for two reasons. Because these technologies grow, and they are used by humans, but they also require energy. And then because, as you can see from the various colors here, these technologies are accompanied by the introduction of other fuels, of new energy resources. In green, you see biomass, mainly wood, that was used before the introduction of coal, which begins around here. So I told you it was already used in the 17th century, but its consumption became visible, let's say, in this period. And then you have oil in red, which started around here, because if here we have the introduction of the gasoline engine, it's because oil was available. Then we have natural gas, and then hydroelectric power is here, and of course nuclear energy starts in this period and from then onward. So you see there is a growth both linked to new introductions, new technologies, but also to the introduction of new forms of energy. This diagram goes between 1850 and 2008, but if we focus on the last part, we see better in this diagram, which was published by the BP Statistical Review of World Energy 2021, so last year. First of all, this higher curve gives you a general trend for energy consumptions at global level, starting from, I believe, 1995 to 2020. You see that this curve is increasing, so we keep increasing our energy consumption, and here there is a decrease, but this was the beginning of the pandemic. So we need to understand whether that decrease is actually a sign of a trend that will last over time, or if it's just linked to a local episode. For example, here there was an economic crisis, and there was a small decrease, but then the general trend picked up and started growing again. On the right-hand side of your screen, you can see the various types of fuels, that is, types of primary energy available, and how they are being used over time from 1995 to 2020, but also in terms of the percentage of the general consumption they represent. For example, oil started around 40% and is definitely decreasing. It's now around 30%. Then for coal, the trend was less constant. There was even an increase between 2005 and 2010, and maybe a bit beyond 2010, but now we see it's decreasing. As for natural gas, we see that the percentage is growing, definitely. Natural gas is an increasing percentage of the energy we use. Then hydropower stayed stable. Nuclear energy is decreasing in percentage terms, whereas we see that renewables are clearly growing. So in this last curve, from 2010, there is a very positive trend. Despite that, you see that it hasn't yet reached 10%. It's maybe around 7-8% of the overall energy consumption. So in the previous image, we saw that fossil fuels are still the main energy source at global level. But we need to add one point on fossil fuels. So first of all, they were introduced relatively recently, and then their duration is not indefinite, regardless of the possible scenarios that we might have. For example, in this diagram down here, you can see the possible expected duration of fossil fuels. And if we consider the reserves that are sure, they will last about 100 years more. If we also consider likely reserves, then it's a bit more. Well, for coal, it's a bit more complicated. But for the other fuels, even including likely reserves, we have about 200 more years, or little more than that. And what am I trying to say with this is that compared to the history of humans on Earth, so as we have seen, starting from the Paleolithic era, it's 2.5 million years ago, the amount of time that fossil fuels have been available is very short. So from the point of view of the overall history, fossil fuels can only be an episode and nothing more than that. regardless of the issues linked to climate change and CO2 emissions. In any case, the history of energy and the use that humans do of that energy must see fossil fuels as an episode. We cannot think that the current situation is long-lasting. Let me also add another consideration. So we would like to move to renewables. And do we have any problem with renewables? Well, we said we do not have problems in renewing energy transformation, but we do have to solve a few problems when looking at the materials we use to create the components where those transformations take place. So here again, the average life of the mines that these materials are taken from is about a few hundred years. And then, of course, we should consider all the geopolitical issues, because the geography of the countries where these materials are available is much different from that of the countries that have fossil fuels available. Of course, we're not going to talk about these geopolitical issues, but I wanted to highlight that also in the case of renewable energies, we still have to pay attention. So we need to be aware, and this is a concept that I've already mentioned, we need to be aware that there is a limit. The Earth is a finite system of resources, not an infinite one. All our arguments and reasonings on energy must take this into consideration. And then another comment, looking at the Industrial Revolution, then the introduction of new technologies, a change in society and economy. Well, the result of all this is that there is a sharp increase in the world population. It is actually an exponential increase, almost, because we need to consider that the x-axis is not linear. If we look from here to there, it's about 50,000 years. From here to there, it's 1,200 years, and between here, 1950 and 2011, there's a bit more than 60 years. So if the x-axis was linear, I would have a much flatter curve at the beginning and a much steeper one at the end. So surely we have had an exponential growth in population. In the diagram for each date, the introduction of particularly important technologies is also shown. We've already said many times that the steam engine and the new economy developed from the availability of new energy. But if we draw a diagram like this one, where we have the consumption of primary energy between 1965 and 2020, that one, and the GDP at the global level, you see that there is a clear link between the two curves. So there is a clear link between energy and the economy. Well, up until this point, we have been making some general considerations at the global level, so energy consumption, energy sources, etc. Let's now consider what has happened at the level of the single individual. So the quantity of energy available or used by the individual. Well, I'm showing you 4 diagrams where you see some indicators that characterize life quality. So we have life expectancy at birth, child death rate, literacy, and food availability. So these indicators are often summarized in the Human Development Index. Here, I would like to highlight that the average world per capita energy consumption, so the general amount of energy consumed divided by the number of people living, is around 80 gigajoules. That is represented by these yellow lines crossing these curves, as you can see. So these curves either increase or decrease, and then there is a sort of a flat part. Maybe here it's not so flat, but the others are definitely quite flat. So let's look at the x-axis of these diagrams. That is the amount of energy per capita. So these values correspond to points where the curve changes quite sharply. That means that when the value increases, I move to my right and the indicator improves. But if I'm here, already in the flat part of the curve, if I increase the amount of per capita energy, the value doesn't really grow. So the average falls at a point where an increase in the amount of energy might still result in an improvement, but we're actually very close to the flat part. If we look at Italy, definitely falls in the flat part of the curve. You see that the average per capita energy consumption for Italy is higher than the average. For Africa, the average is, of course, quite different. As you can see, it falls at a point of the curve where higher quantities of energy would result in an improvement of the quality of life. And if we look at the average of developed countries, the OECD, that is the Organization of Developed Countries, here we find that the average per capita value, Italy is part of the OECD, but it consumes a bit less than the average per capita consumption. So the average is quite high for OECD, and it falls in the part of the curve where even a decrease in the amount of energy would not result in much. So this diagram refers to a specific year. And I'm saying this because those curves interpolate the values of several countries, for which the value of that indicator was calculated as linked to the value of energy availability. But if we look at a more dynamic view, that is, considering time, for example, we have the same curves for 1990 or 2015, that's the red one at the top. We see that over time, the same amount of per capita energy corresponds to a higher quality of life. So by paying more attention to specific behaviors and being more efficient, we've been able to ensure a higher quality of life with the same amount of energy. The HDI is the Human Development Index, that is the indicator summarizing the four indicators we saw earlier. Let's also look at the single country's performance over time. For example, China here is increasing their per capita consumption and it's improving their quality of life. This country, for example, is much more virtuous. That's Mexico. It is improving its quality of life without increasing the amount of energy. Italy is this green one. It has increased its per capita consumption for a while now. It's decreasing it. So to go back to previous values, but with a much higher level of quality of life. This last country is the US, which starts from a very high level of consumption and very high levels of quantity of life. Now, the quality of life is improving for them, while the quantity of energy is decreasing. Now, how do we use this amount of per capita energy? Where does this consumption stem from? Because, of course, it does not include only the energy we use to eat and keep our vital functions going. This diagram explains what happens to the energy that individuals consume. So here we see that humans consume about 140 watts for their physical activities. But all of the other activities humans do during their day, from using their cell phones, catching a train, driving to work, and all the appliances that we have at home, so all this requires about 1600 watts. So how does this energy get to humans? So on the one side, from the sun, through photosynthesis, that gives food to plants and animals that are then eaten by humans. On the other side, especially this amount of energy, 1650 watts, actually this power that we need comes from the industrial system, which uses the energy from fossil fuels, which comes from the sun through photosynthesis in a very long time. And it uses renewable energy. That is energy from the sun, which is transformed into energy available to the industrial system. But of course, this system is not completely efficient. So in order to provide us with 1600 watts, the system actually has to produce more. And so the total is the sum of these two amounts. So all this is the explanation of the per capita consumption of energy, and all this is used by humans for their activities, and at the end it is transformed into heat. Any activity ultimately becomes heat, which is then dispersed in the environment, so everything goes back to the biosphere. Now, let's look at a different problem. We have seen the average energy consumption of humans. But as we have seen from the diagrams on life quality, not everyone consumes that average amount that, if you remember, was 79 gigajoules. So actually, consumption varies significantly around the world. And here we find Italy, we're around 100, as I said earlier. Here's China, close to Italy now. Whereas, for example, in the Russian Federation, consumption is still quite high. Africa and the underdeveloped Asian countries are still at a very low level, very close to that of the classic world and the Renaissance. So there are great inequalities, which we can look at also in geographic terms. So the light areas have less per capita energy available. The darker areas use more per capita energy. Now let's find another way to look at the same information. Because, of course, one thing is to look at a map, but a different thing is to understand how many people are involved at each level. So here we see how many people have a certain level of available energy. So if you remember, 2021 was the level of the Renaissance or Roman period. So if we look at these 21 gigajoules per person on the diagram, well, 50 is about here, we go up from here, we get here, which means that about 22% of the population in the world is still at energy levels that are equal to or less than those of the Roman times. Let's look for the average value. It was about 80. So this is 75. So from here we go up vertically and we get to about 60%. That means that more than 60% of the world does not reach that average value. And this implies strong inequalities. Which result in social tensions. In fact, energy is one of the main causes of war, at least it has been in the past, because of social tensions, but also to guarantee one's access to energy sources. So there is a link between energy and war, because energy may cause a war, but also because a war today requires a great consumption of energy, both the energy required by weapons and that required by the industry producing weapons. And then, hopefully, there's peace. At least so far it's been like that. And during peace periods, reconstruction happens. And it requires huge quantities of energy. Well, let's add one more element. I showed you the link between energy and the economy, and now let's add the element of climate change. So this is the same diagram I showed you before, but now it also shows CO2 emissions. So this is the primary energy. This is the trend of CO2 emissions, and this is GDP. So the three of them are quite close together. Now, unlike the previous diagram, this one also shows the trends of available per capita energy. So here we see that per capita GDP keeps growing. It's this yellow line, but the trend of energy consumed per capita is different. And the CO2 per capita is different too. So the three curves are decoupled. That is to say, at an individual level, income increases, but the consumption of energy and CO2 emissions do not necessarily increase. So why does this happen at the individual level, but then at the global level this effect is no longer seen? Well, because the single individual may consume less and produce less CO2, but where there are more people, in the end the sum keeps growing. So there's the population effect. And due to the growth, and actually the growth of the population as an issue cannot be overlooked when talking about both energy and climate change. Now, let me summarize this second part of the lesson. I tried to highlight a number of links between energy and human evolution, the importance of fire we talked about. Then I have underlined the link between energy and the universe, the idea of the set direction, the link between energy and world population and the economy, the link between energy and the political context, social tensions, and ultimately also war. Finally, the link with climate change. And I haven't really talked about this, but there is a link also between energy and land use, because in order to produce energy, we need to occupy space. And in the current plants and oil wells, we have a very high energy density, but it's different to produce energy with primary sources. I haven't had the time to discuss this in much detail, but it is something that should certainly be considered. So it's clear that talking about energy, we have a very complex framework. It's a multidimensional issue. It's difficult to understand what is the main driver of the issue. So, if the energy issue highlights so many aspects that are all intertwined with complex cause and effect relations, then the following question is important. When we talk about energy transition, what are we really talking about? What do we mean? So the most frequent answer is that energy transition is a structural shift to a different energy system, including renewable energies. This change must include a new access to energy, primary conversion processes, energy supply, and energy services. Now, I think that stopping at this definition is not enough. I think that energy transition cannot be just this. It cannot just be the change from one form of primary energy to another form. If we limited ourselves to this point of view, we might probably find an answer to climate change, but all the other issues on the table, those wouldn't be resolved. For example, the link between energy and the economy would go unaltered. So with the current paradigms, we would require ever-growing quantities of energy. The same goes for the land used to produce that energy. And then we would start to worry about the availability of minerals needed in the new energy conversions, and the inequalities in terms of consumption and quality of life would go unaltered. And they would keep causing international tensions. So, energy transition must be interpreted as a much wider and complex process involving social transformations, economic transformation, and individuals must be involved. So it must lead to a change in individuals' behavior. So if this doesn't happen, so unless everyone is involved and unless individuals are aware that, as you can see, I wrote energy is a very precious good, without this, it will be very difficult for us to overcome all the difficulties I tried to briefly list. Now, this image I chose does not represent one single person thinking or one person who understood that energy is a precious commodity. I added several people in this image, and they are all holding hands. So they are a community of individuals. I believe that a very important sign comes from the RED II European Directive, which promotes energy communities. Well, unfortunately, there is no time now to explain energy communities in detail, but I'd like to say, at least, that in energy communities, single individuals and citizens, from consumers, they become producers, or actually both consumers and producers at the same time, so the so-called prosumers. Becoming producers of a commodity helps to understand how precious that commodity is. So it is a way to raise awareness on the issue of energy. And I think that it is a very important sign of the direction we need to go. Now, to wrap up, to close this lesson on energy, I would like to say that, as I've already said, basically we cannot change the direction of our path. We cannot stop time. We cannot stop the sand from falling within the hourglass. But we can interpret sustainability as the way to make sure that humanity's journey is as long as possible, because we can vary the speed of the sand, so the speed of our journey. And energy surely is a key element to be able to do this. And as I've tried to explain, the problem is so complex and articulated that surely technology and innovation can give a very important contribution, but we will be able to tackle this problem and overcome it only if these two tools, that is technology and innovation, will be used in a wide, comprehensive and multidisciplinary view. With this, I would like to close and thank you for your attention.